The sun rose slowly over the endless desert, casting a harsh golden light on the shifting sand dunes. Every grain seemed to sparkle under its glare. But for the young man making his way across this barren land, the beauty of the morning was lost in the reality of his situation. He had set out on this journey full of hope and determination, eager to reach the distant town that lay on the other side of the desert. But now, with every step he took, he felt the desert's immense power pressing down on him, testing not just his body, but his mind. From the very beginning, this desert journey had been difficult. His companions had all warned him about the dangers, about how unforgiving the sun could be and how the nights could be freezing cold. But he had been confident, believing that preparation and careful planning could overcome any obstacle. He had carried water, a small amount of food, and a few essential tools. Yet, as he walked, the sun climbed higher and the warmth of the desert soon turned into a relentless, almost unbearable heat. The water he carried began to feel like it was disappearing faster than he expected. Every sip he took seemed to vanish into the dry air almost immediately, leaving only a small, fleeting relief. The young man noticed the effects almost immediately. His throat burned constantly and his mouth felt like sandpaper. Each step became heavier than the last, as though the desert itself was trying to hold him back. Sweat soaked through his clothes, and even the lightest movements felt like an effort. He tried to stay focused, repeating to himself that he must not give up, that he must keep moving no matter what. The desert, however, seemed determined to challenge his willpower at every moment. By midday, the heat had become suffocating. The sun, now high in the sky, was unforgiving, and the sand reflected the light with blinding intensity. He had been walking for hours, and yet, when he looked around, he saw nothing but endless dunes stretching toward the horizon. There was no shade, no water, nothing familiar or comforting. Even the wind, which had been a slight companion in the morning, now felt harsh and hot, carrying tiny grains of sand that stung his skin and eyes. He felt the first real waves of fear creeping into his mind. He remembered the map he had studied so carefully. It showed a small oasis somewhere ahead, a place where he could drink and rest. But as he scanned the horizon, he realized that the dunes had shifted since the map had been drawn. The landmarks were gone, swallowed by the ever-moving sands. Panic began to rise in him. He tried to steady his breathing, reminding himself that he must stay calm. He could not afford to panic, not in a place like this. Every decision he made mattered. One wrong step could lead him further into the heart of the desert, farther from safety than he could imagine. Hours passed, and the young man began to notice the first signs of extreme dehydration. His mouth was dry and cracked, his lips bleeding slightly, and his tongue felt swollen and rough. His steps became unsteady, and each breath felt like a battle against the heat pressing on his chest. At one point, he tried to drink from the small amount of water he had left, only to find that it was almost gone. A sinking feeling settled deep in his stomach. He realized that he might soon be without any water at all. The desert did not show mercy. He had to keep moving. Yet the energy needed to lift his feet felt almost impossible to find. He collapsed onto the sand briefly, wiping sweat from his eyes and trying to gather strength. He closed his eyes and thought of his family, imagining how worried they would be if they knew he was out here alone. That thought gave him a small spark of motivation. He forced himself to stand, to take one step after another, even though the weight of exhaustion pressed down like a heavy blanket. As the sun reached its peak, the young man began to experience the desert's psychological challenges. He started to see illusions in the sand, pools of water shimmering in the distance, trees that vanished when he drew closer, and the faint shadow of buildings that disappeared as he tried to reach them. Each time his hope was raised only to be crushed, and yet he forced himself to move forward. He learned quickly that the desert could play tricks on the mind, that survival required not only strength of body but strength of mind. By late afternoon, the heat began to wane slightly as the sun started its slow descent toward the horizon. Yet the young man's situation did not improve. His skin was red and raw from the relentless sun. His muscles ached, and he felt a dizziness that made it difficult to keep his balance. He realized that he had been walking in circles at some points, too weak and disoriented to notice. The desert seemed endless, and he had no choice but to continue. He told himself that night would bring cooler temperatures, and perhaps he could rest and recover some strength. The thought of relief pushed him forward step by painful step. As evening approached, the temperature dropped rapidly, and the desert transformed. The scorching heat of the day gave way to an icy chill. The young man shivered, his body now fighting against the cold. His sunburned skin ached, and he had no shelter to protect himself from the wind. He tried to make a small fire with the little kindling he could find, but the desert's sparse vegetation offered almost nothing. With the fire failing to light, he wrapped himself in the thin cloth he had and huddled on the sand, trying to conserve as much warmth as possible. Night in the desert was lonely and frightening. The young man lay awake, staring at the star-filled sky, feeling the vast emptiness of the desert press down on him. Every sound, the distant call of a bird, the whisper of the wind, the shift of sand, made him jump. His mind drifted between memories of home and thoughts of survival, never settling. Hunger gnawed at his stomach, but the worst was the thirst that never went away. He had already drunk nearly all of his water, and he knew that the next day could be his last if he did not find help. Despite the despair, he found a small ember of determination. He reminded himself that he had survived this long, that giving up was not an option. He reviewed the lessons he had learned from his journey, the importance of conserving energy, the need to keep moving, and the delicate balance between hope and reality. Each lesson was etched into his mind through struggle, and each step forward, however difficult, was a step toward survival. By the time the first hints of dawn painted the horizon, the young man was ready to rise again. His body was exhausted, but his mind was determined. The desert had tested him like nothing else before, but he had endured. He had survived the first day without food or water, and though he did not know what the next day would bring, he knew he could not stop. Somewhere in the vast emptiness of the desert, help waited, though he did not know where or in what form. Little did he know, fate was about to intervene in a way he could never have imagined. The hardships of the desert had pushed him to the brink, yet they also prepared him for a miraculous encounter that would change the course of his journey forever. As he stepped forward into the uncertain morning light, every movement was driven not only by the desire to survive but by the deep hope that someone extraordinary, would find him and give him a chance to live. The second day in the desert arrived with a faint pink glow on the horizon, signaling another long, merciless day. The young man rose slowly from the sand, his body aching from the previous day's struggle. Every muscle protested, stiff and sore from the endless walking and the chilling night. His mouth was dry and cracked, and even breathing felt heavy. Yet, despite the pain, he forced himself to move forward. The thought of giving up never crossed his mind completely. Deep down, he knew that survival depended on one thing: perseverance. As the sun climbed higher, the desert seemed even more unrelenting than the day before. The sand shimmered under the heat, creating mirages that played tricks on his eyes. At one moment, he thought he saw a small pool of water in the distance, only to find that it vanished as he drew closer. These illusions were cruel, teasing him with hope and snatching it away just as quickly. Each time, disappointment threatened to weaken his spirit, but he gritted his teeth and kept moving, refusing to let despair control him. Hunger had become a constant companion. The small amount of food he had carried was gone, leaving his stomach empty and aching. His energy was fading, making each step a battle. He tried to conserve his strength, walking slowly and deliberately, stopping whenever he could rest even briefly. But the desert offered no mercy. There was no shade, no shelter, no oasis in sight. The sand stretched endlessly in every direction, and the relentless sun beat down on him, burning his skin and making every movement a struggle. The young man's mind began to play tricks on him. He imagined hearing voices in the wind, faint calls that seemed like someone shouting his name. Shadows in the sand appeared to move, creating shapes that vanished when he focused on them. At one point, he swore he saw a group of travelers far ahead, waving to him. He ran toward them only to find nothing but empty dunes. Fear began to mix with exhaustion. He realized that he was not only fighting the desert, but also the effects it had on his mind. The hallucinations were a warning. Dehydration and hunger were starting to take their toll. By midday, his situation had become desperate. His tongue felt thick and swollen, and each swallow of saliva was painful. Sweat continued to pour from his body, but it provided no relief, only making his skin raw and sensitive. His eyes burned from the brightness of the sun, and the heat made it difficult to focus. He stumbled several times, almost falling into small sand valleys, but each time he forced himself to stand. The thought of stopping terrified him. He knew that if he fell and could not rise, the desert would claim him. He searched desperately for any signs of life, birds, plants, or insects, anything that could indicate water nearby. Occasionally he found small dry shrubs, but none provided sustenance. He tried digging in the sand, hoping for a hidden stream or water source, but all he found was dry earth. His body screamed for water, but there was none. Thirst had become a sharp, almost unbearable pain. His lips were cracked and his skin felt tight and raw. Every breath seemed like a struggle, and every step required tremendous effort. The heat continued into the afternoon, growing more intense as the sun reached its peak. The young man's shadow stretched long and thin across the sand, a small figure in the vast desert. At times he wondered how anyone could survive in such a place without help. The desert was beautiful in its way, but it was a beauty that demanded respect and tested every ounce of human strength. He stumbled again, this time nearly collapsing. He dropped to his knees, placing his hands in the sand to steady himself. The grains were hot under his palms and the heat rose through his body like fire. As the hours passed, exhaustion began to cloud his mind further. Thoughts became jumbled and he struggled to remember why he had come to this place. Fear crept in quietly, a whisper that asked if he would ever see home again. The sun dipped slightly, casting long shadows over the dunes, and the young man realized that he could not continue much longer without help. He tried to ignore the fear, repeating quietly to himself that he could survive, that he must survive. His body was failing, but his determination remained stubbornly strong. By late afternoon, his strength was almost gone. He sank to the sand, unable to take another step without resting. Every movement felt heavy, as though he was carrying a weight far greater than his own body. His lips trembled and his voice had almost disappeared entirely. Even calling out for help seemed impossible. The desert was silent except for the whisper of the wind, and the isolation pressed on him like a living thing. It was in this moment of deepest weakness that he realized how close he had come to death. Night fell quickly in the desert, bringing a biting cold that contrasted sharply with the heat of the day. The young man shivered, wrapping his thin clothing tightly around his body. His skin, sunburned and raw, felt sensitive even to the lightest touch of the wind. The sand was cold beneath him and the darkness seemed endless. He closed his eyes, trying to rest, but exhaustion and fear kept him awake. He thought of water, of food, of warmth, small comforts that had become distant memories. The ache in his stomach and throat was relentless. Hunger and thirst were no longer just discomforts. They were urgent warnings that his body was failing. As he lay there, a strange combination of fear and hope filled him. He was terrified of dying alone in this vast desert, yet part of him believed that help could come. He thought of the stories he had heard about the kindness of strangers and wondered if, perhaps, someone lived nearby who could save him. These thoughts were fleeting, like the desert wind, but they gave him the smallest spark of strength to keep moving, if only for a little longer. The second day had taught him much about the desert. He realized that survival was more than just moving forward. It was about observing, listening, and understanding the land. Every dune, every shadow, every shift in the wind carried meaning. The desert was both enemy and teacher, and those who ignored its lessons did not survive. He learned painfully that patience and caution were as necessary as courage and determination. By early dawn on the third day, the young man knew that he could not continue alone much longer. His body was at its limit and his mind was frail from lack of rest, food, and water. Every step was an effort, and yet, something within him refused to surrender. He understood that survival would require more than strength. It would require help from someone who knew the desert, someone capable of saving him from its merciless grip. And it was in this moment, teetering between despair and hope, that the young man's story was about to take an extraordinary turn. Just as the desert seemed ready to claim him, fate had other plans. He would meet someone whose courage, wisdom, and kindness would give him a second chance at life, sustaining him when he had nothing left to rely upon. The harshness of the desert had prepared him, making him ready to accept the help he so desperately needed. As the young man stumbled through the desert, his body weakened and his mind foggy from thirst and hunger. A faint glimmer appeared on the horizon. At first he thought it was another mirage, another trick of the desert to torment him. But as he squinted against the harsh sunlight, he realized it was real. A small dwelling, almost hidden among the dunes and rocky terrain, stood silently against the vast emptiness. His heart leapt. Could this be help? Could someone really be living out here, willing to aid him when all hope seemed lost? He pushed himself forward, though his legs trembled and every step felt heavier than the last. The thought of water and shelter motivated him, giving him a renewed spark of energy. The closer he came to the dwelling, the more he noticed signs of life. Smoke rose faintly from a small chimney, curling into the clear sky. The dwelling was simple, built from stone and mud, yet it exuded a sense of stability and security that contrasted sharply with the endless, chaotic desert. The young man felt a wave of relief wash over him, mixed with disbelief. He had survived so much to reach this point. Was someone truly here to save him? A door opened and a figure appeared, a woman strong and confident despite her small frame. She was an Apache widow, living alone in the harsh desert, accustomed to surviving in conditions that would overwhelm most people. Her eyes, sharp and watchful, immediately took in the sight of the exhausted young man. She could see at once how weak he had become, how close he was to collapse. There was no hesitation in her gaze, only a quiet, steady understanding of what needed to be done. The young man called out, his voice hoarse and nearly gone. "Please, help me, I'm dying." The words were barely audible, carried away almost instantly by the desert wind. The widow acted without hesitation. She stepped forward, guiding him gently toward the dwelling. Every movement she made was purposeful and careful, aware that he was fragile and that any sudden motion could worsen his condition. She offered him a hand, steadying him as he stumbled, and he clutched it as though it were a lifeline. Once inside, the widow assessed his condition. She could see the sunburn on his skin, the cracked lips, the hollow eyes, and the exhaustion etched into every line of his face. She knew immediately that he was dehydrated, malnourished, and near collapse. She spoke to him softly, her voice gentle but firm, telling him that he was safe now. There was no judgment, no surprise, only a calm certainty that he would survive with her care. The young man, too weak to respond fully, nodded faintly, his body sagging into the warmth of the dwelling. She began by giving him water, small sips at a time, careful not to overwhelm his fragile body. The water soothed his parched throat and cooled his burning lips. For the first time in days, the young man felt relief that went beyond the physical. It was a relief of hope, of knowing that someone cared, that someone had reached out to save him. He drank slowly, each sip revitalizing him just enough to hold on to consciousness. Next, the widow prepared simple, nourishing food. Though he had not eaten in days, she knew he needed to regain strength gradually. She offered soft, easy-to-digest meals, encouraging him to eat slowly. Every bite restored a bit of his energy, and with each small meal he felt a little closer to life again. The desert had taken so much from him, but here, in the care of this extraordinary woman, he began to reclaim it. Then came the most unexpected act of kindness. The widow offered her milk, a practice she knew could sustain him in a way nothing else could. It was a deeply personal act, born of necessity and compassion. The young man hesitated, overwhelmed by gratitude, but he knew he had no other option if he wanted to survive. Each time he drank, he felt life returning to him. The weakness that had nearly claimed him began to fade slowly, replaced by warmth and renewed strength. The desert had been merciless, but here he was given a second chance. During the following days, she watched over him tirelessly. She made sure he stayed hydrated, fed, and rested. She knew the desert was unpredictable, and that his body needed time to recover fully. He slept more than he had in days, and each time he woke, he found himself a little stronger, a little more able to stand and move. His muscles, previously numb and weak, began to respond once again, and his mind, clouded by dehydration, cleared with every passing hour. Through their conversations, he learned about her life. The widow had lived in the desert for many years, learning to survive in a place where only the strongest and most resourceful could thrive. She shared stories of the land, the plants, and the hidden water sources. She taught him the signs to watch for, how to recognize the subtle clues that could mean life or death in the desert. Each story was a lesson, and he absorbed every word, realizing that survival required not just strength but knowledge and respect for the harsh environment. He began to admire her resilience. She had survived hardships he could barely imagine, living alone and facing challenges that would have broken others. Yet she remained compassionate, using her strength to save someone else rather than succumbing to bitterness or isolation. The young man felt a deep respect and gratitude for her, understanding that without her he would not have lived. This realization strengthened his resolve not just to survive, but to honor the gift of life she had given him. Their days followed a steady rhythm. She taught him how to find water hidden under the sand, how to recognize which plants were safe to eat, and how to travel through the desert without wasting precious energy. He learned to be patient, to observe the land carefully, and to respect its dangers. In return, he shared small parts of his life, telling her about his family, his dreams, and the journey that had brought him here. These exchanges, though simple, forged a bond of trust and mutual respect between them. As the days passed, the young man began to regain his independence. His body grew stronger, his steps more confident, and his mind sharper. The constant threat of death receded into the background, replaced by cautious optimism. He could feel himself becoming capable once more, though he never forgot how close he had come to losing everything. Each meal, each sip of water, each bit of care from the widow was a reminder of the fragility of life and the power of human kindness. Through her actions, the young man learned a profound lesson about survival. It was not just about food, water, or shelter. It was about hope, compassion, and the willingness of others to extend a helping hand when it was needed most. The desert had stripped him down to his most basic needs, but in return, it had shown him the extraordinary impact of one person's courage and generosity. The widow's care had done more than sustain his body. It had renewed his spirit and reminded him that even in the harshest conditions, kindness could prevail. By the end of the week, the young man felt almost like a new person. The desert's trials were still fresh in his memory, but he was no longer the weak, desperate traveler who had arrived at the widow's door. He had learned to endure, to respect the land, and to accept help when it was offered. Most importantly, he had learned that survival was possible, even in the harshest of environments when someone extended care and compassion in the face of danger. And so, as the sun set over the desert, painting the dunes with golden light, the young man sat beside the widow, feeling a quiet sense of gratitude and reflection. The desert was still vast and merciless, but he knew that he had been given a second chance, a gift of life that he would never forget. The extraordinary kindness of this solitary Apache widow had not only saved him but had changed him, teaching him the deepest lessons of survival, trust, and the enduring power of human goodness. Days turned into weeks as the young man stayed in the desert dwelling, slowly regaining his strength under the careful watch of the Apache widow. At first, he had been too weak even to lift a cup of water without trembling. Now, he could walk steadily across the sandy terrain, and his body began to recover the energy it had lost during the brutal desert ordeal. Every morning, he woke to the gentle sunlight streaming through the small windows of the dwelling, feeling a little stronger than the day before. The widow's care had not only restored his physical health, but also his hope and confidence. The widow, patient and wise, began to teach him the secrets of desert survival. She showed him how to read the landscape, how to find small pockets of water hidden beneath the sand, and how to recognize plants that were safe to eat. Each lesson was carefully explained, and each time he tried, she corrected him gently, never showing frustration. He marveled at her knowledge, realizing that the desert, which had almost taken his life, could also be mastered with understanding and skill. Walking with her across the dunes became a daily routine. At first, the young man stumbled over uneven sand and rocks, his legs still weak from days of dehydration and hunger. But she guided him patiently, teaching him to step carefully, to conserve energy, and to move with intention. She explained that every action in the desert had a purpose, that wasteful movements could cost valuable energy and might even be dangerous. Slowly, he began to move more like someone who belonged in this harsh environment, learning the rhythm and patterns of the land around him. She taught him how to listen to the wind, to understand its subtle messages. A sudden shift in direction might signal a coming storm, she explained, or indicate that a nearby animal had found water. The young man learned to pay attention to details he would have once overlooked: the texture of the sand beneath his feet, the shapes of clouds on the horizon, and the behavior of birds flying overhead. Each lesson made him feel more alive, more connected to the land that had once seemed so deadly. In addition to survival skills, she taught him the importance of patience and observation. They would sit for hours, watching the desert quietly, noticing the smallest changes. Sometimes he would become frustrated with the slow pace of learning, but she reminded him that rushing could be dangerous. "The desert teaches those who wait and watch," she said softly, "not those who hurry blindly." Her words stayed with him, and he began to appreciate the lessons of stillness as much as those of action. Over time, their bond grew stronger. Though they spoke little at first, their shared experiences created an unspoken connection. He began to understand the widow's resilience and courage, and she came to trust him, seeing that he was willing to learn and respect the land. Together, they worked to make daily life in the desert manageable. She showed him how to gather wood for small fires, how to store water efficiently, and how to prepare simple meals that sustained them both. Life, once terrifying and uncertain, became a steady routine filled with small victories. The young man also began to reflect on his own journey. He realized that the desert had changed him in ways he had never expected. The struggle for survival had taught him humility, patience, and the importance of relying on others. He had once believed that courage alone could overcome any obstacle, but he now understood that strength also came from knowledge, careful planning, and the kindness of others. Each day spent with the widow reinforced this lesson, reminding him that life was fragile and precious. Despite the harshness of the desert outside, the dwelling became a place of safety and learning. The widow shared stories of her own life, teaching him about the traditions and culture of her people. She spoke of her experiences growing up in the desert, learning to survive from elders who understood the land deeply. The young man listened intently, absorbing every word, realizing that these lessons were as important as the food and water that had kept him alive. Her stories gave context to the skills she was teaching, connecting the practical survival lessons to a larger understanding of respect and harmony with the natural world. With each passing day, he grew stronger and more confident. He began to help with daily tasks around the dwelling, gathering firewood, helping to carry water, and even preparing meals. The widow watched him with quiet pride, noting how far he had come since the day she had found him nearly unconscious in the desert. She did not offer unnecessary praise, understanding that true confidence came from achievement and perseverance. But her satisfaction was clear in the careful guidance she continued to provide and the steady patience she showed him every day. One morning, as the sun rose over the dunes, the young man realized something profound. He was no longer the fragile traveler who had arrived at the widow's door. He had endured the desert's trials, learned its lessons, and rebuilt his strength from near collapse. For the first time, he felt capable of facing the desert on his own, equipped with knowledge, skill, and experience that could protect him. The journey that had seemed impossible now felt manageable, and he recognized that this transformation was due almost entirely to the widow's care and guidance. Yet, even as he regained his independence, he remained deeply grateful. Every meal, every sip of water, every lesson had been a gift, a lifeline that had allowed him to survive and thrive. He reflected on the generosity and courage of the widow, realizing that her kindness had done more than sustain his body. It had restored his faith in humanity. In a place as harsh and unforgiving as the desert, her actions had been extraordinary, proving that compassion could exist even in the most challenging environments. Their time together also fostered a sense of mutual respect. The young man learned not just survival skills, but also the value of humility and cooperation. He began to understand that the desert, for all its beauty and danger, was a place that required balance between caution and courage, patience and action, independence and reliance on others. The widow had mastered this balance through years of experience, and he now followed her example, learning to navigate life with the same careful thought and respect. As days turned into weeks, small improvements in the young man's abilities became noticeable. He could walk longer distances without exhaustion, identify safe plants and water sources, and even anticipate changes in the weather. The desert no longer felt entirely hostile. It became a place he could understand and adapt to, a challenging teacher rather than a relentless enemy. Each skill he acquired felt like a victory, each success reinforcing his confidence and determination to survive. The widow's presence remained constant throughout this period, a steady anchor in the unpredictable desert. She continued to provide care, teach lessons, and guide him through the land. Her quiet strength and wisdom became a source of inspiration. He realized that survival was not just about enduring hardship, but about learning from those who had mastered it. Her guidance allowed him to transform fear into knowledge, weakness into skill, and isolation into a shared sense of purpose. By the end of this period, the young man had not only regained his physical health, but had developed a deep understanding of the desert and its rhythms. He felt prepared to continue his journey, should he choose to leave, yet he knew that he owed a debt of gratitude that went beyond words. The widow's care had saved his life, and the lessons she had taught him would remain with him forever. He recognized that he had been given more than survival. He had been given wisdom, compassion, and the chance to start anew. Sitting outside, the dwelling one evening, watching the sun sink behind the dunes, the young man reflected on how far he had come. From the brink of death just a few weeks earlier, he was now strong, confident, and capable. The desert had been ruthless, but it had also been a teacher, and the widow had been his guide. Through patience, skill, and unwavering kindness, she had shown him the true meaning of survival, and he knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, he would carry these lessons with him, remembering always the extraordinary person who had given him a second chance at life. After weeks of care, guidance, and recovery, the young man finally felt ready to leave the desert dwelling. His body was strong, his mind clear, and his spirit renewed. Yet as he prepared to depart, a mix of emotions filled him: gratitude, sadness, and a deep respect for the woman who had saved his life. He knew that without her intervention, without her courage and kindness, he would not be alive to see this day. The desert had been a relentless test, but it had also revealed the extraordinary capacity for compassion in humanity. The Apache widow watched him carefully as he packed his few belongings. Her expression was calm, but her eyes reflected the pride she felt in his growth. He had arrived at her doorstep weak, dehydrated, and near death. Now he was capable, knowledgeable, and ready to face the desert on his own if he had to. She had taught him survival skills, patience, and respect for the land, but more importantly, she had shown him the power of empathy and human kindness. Before leaving, he wanted to express his gratitude. Words seemed inadequate for the magnitude of her generosity. "I don't know how to thank you," he said quietly, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "You saved my life. Without you, I wouldn't be here." The widow smiled faintly, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You have survived because you wanted to live," she replied. "I only helped you find the strength you already had. Remember what you have learned, and you will carry that strength with you forever." He nodded, feeling the truth of her words. She had not only given him sustenance, but had also empowered him with knowledge and confidence. He knew that the lessons of the desert and her guidance would remain with him for the rest of his life. They had spent weeks together, sharing stories, observing the desert, and learning from one another. What had begun as a desperate encounter had transformed into a bond built on trust, respect, and mutual understanding. The young man stepped outside into the open desert, feeling the warmth of the sun and the rough texture of the sand beneath his feet. For a moment he paused, taking a deep breath and looking back at the dwelling that had been his sanctuary. He remembered the first day he had arrived, nearly unconscious and on the verge of death, and he marveled at the journey that had brought him to this point. The desert, once a place of fear and danger, now felt like a teacher and a companion, its lessons etched into every step he took. As he began walking, the widow remained at the doorway, watching silently. She had seen countless travelers come and go, but few had faced the desert with such determination and resilience. She knew that he was ready, that he had absorbed every lesson and had grown stronger in mind and body. The desert would still challenge him, but he was no longer helpless. He had learned to read its signs, to find water, and to navigate its terrain with care. The tools she had given him were now his own, and he would carry them forward into the world beyond the dunes. The journey through the desert was still difficult, but the young man faced it with confidence rather than fear. Each step was deliberate, each decision made with caution and awareness. He felt the wind on his face, warm and dry, but he no longer recoiled from it. Instead, he observed its direction, its strength, and what it could tell him about the landscape ahead. The sun, once an enemy, was now a guide, signaling the time to rest and the direction to travel. Every challenge became an opportunity to apply the skills he had learned, to prove to himself that he was capable of surviving in even the harshest conditions. Along the way, he reflected on the lessons of patience and observation that the widow had taught him. He learned to move slowly, conserving energy, and to pay attention to the small details that could mean the difference between life and death. He noticed subtle shifts in the sand, the way certain plants grew near hidden water sources, and the flight patterns of birds that hinted at nearby life. The desert, which had once seemed infinite and impossible, now revealed its secrets to him, each discovery reinforcing his confidence and sense of accomplishment. As he walked, he also thought about the broader lessons of humanity that he had learned from the widow. Her kindness, courage, and generosity had shown him that even in a world full of challenges and dangers, there were people willing to extend help without expectation of reward. She had given him not only food and water but hope, guidance, and the confidence to survive. Her actions had taught him the importance of compassion, of reaching out to others in need, and of understanding that survival was not solely about individual strength, but also about connection and trust. The young man knew that he could not repay her in any way that would fully match her generosity, but he carried a deep sense of gratitude in his heart. Every step he took away from the dwelling was a silent promise to honor her gift of life by living fully, wisely, and with kindness toward others. He understood that the desert had tested him to his limits, but it had also given him an extraordinary opportunity to learn, grow, and appreciate the true value of human support and resilience. As he traveled farther from the dwelling, he began to encounter the familiar challenges of the desert: scorching heat during the day, cold nights, and the endless expanse of sand stretching to the horizon. Yet he faced these challenges differently now. He had survived hunger and thirst, learned to find water and shelter, and developed the patience to endure hardships without panic. Each difficulty was no longer a threat, but a chance to practice and apply the lessons he had learned, strengthening both his body and his spirit. The young man also reflected on how the experience had changed him. He had arrived in the desert as someone confident but inexperienced, relying on courage alone. The desert had stripped him down, testing every aspect of his being, and the widow had nurtured him back to life. He realized that strength was more than physical endurance. It was knowledge, patience, and the willingness to accept help when needed. These insights would guide him not only through the desert but through life itself, shaping the person he was becoming. Finally, after days of careful travel, he reached the edge of the desert where the land began to change. The sand gave way to rocky terrain, then sparse vegetation, and eventually signs of human habitation. The journey that had once seemed impossible was now nearly complete. He looked back at the desert, its vastness stretching as far as the eye could see, and felt a deep sense of respect for its challenges. He had faced death, learned its harsh lessons, and emerged stronger. And he knew that this survival was made possible by the courage and care of the Apache widow, who had found him when all seemed lost. As he approached the first signs of a town, he paused to consider what he would do next. The desert had taught him self-reliance, observation, and survival, but it had also taught him gratitude and humility. He knew that he could share these lessons with others, that the experience had given him not only life but insight into the human spirit. He resolved to carry these lessons forward, helping others when possible and remembering the extraordinary act of kindness that had changed his life forever. Looking back one final time, he silently thanked the widow. She had remained behind in the desert, a quiet guardian of its secrets, yet her impact on his life would be lasting. He felt a surge of determination, a commitment to live fully, wisely, and with compassion. The desert had tested him, the widow had saved him, and now he was ready to face the world beyond, armed with both survival skills and a deeper understanding of what it meant to be human. The young man walked on, each step a reminder of the journey he had endured and the person he had become. He carried water in small amounts, food carefully rationed, and most importantly, the knowledge and wisdom that had been imparted to him. Every challenge ahead would be easier because of what he had learned in the desert and from the extraordinary woman who had shown him the power of courage, resilience, and kindness. By the time he reached the town, he was exhausted but triumphant. The journey had tested him physically, mentally, and emotionally, but he had emerged stronger, wiser, and forever changed. He found people, safety, and the comforts he had longed for. Yet the lessons of the desert remained vivid in his mind. He had survived hunger, thirst, and the merciless heat, but he had also learned to trust, to observe, and to appreciate the kindness of others. In the years that followed, the young man often reflected on the desert and the Apache widow. He carried her lessons into every aspect of his life, understanding that the strength of the human spirit was matched only by the power of compassion. He shared these lessons with others whenever he could, hoping to inspire the same resilience, respect, and kindness that had saved him. Though he would never forget the harsh trials of the desert, he would always remember that even in the most unforgiving places, hope and human goodness could prevail. And so the young man continued his journey, forever changed by the desert and the woman who had given him a second chance at life. His heart was full of gratitude, his mind sharp with knowledge, and his spirit ready for whatever challenges lay ahead. The desert had tested him, and the Apache widow had saved him, leaving him with a story of survival, compassion, and enduring human strength that he would carry with him for the rest of his life.